Okay, I think at about almost halfway or a quarter of the way through this day, we've kind of got the handle on switching from panel to panel. I'm really excited to have each of you with us. We're so excited to have Bridget Harvey, who's the Assistant Director at UNICEF, Amanda Abrom, who's the manager of the Global Schools program with STSN, Meredith Story, who's our education manager at the SDG Academy, and James, who's in technology innovations consultant at, oh gosh, Orvichtra Innovation.
Yes.
Did I say that right? Okay.
Yes, you did.
Awesome. Okay. So we're really excited to transition into something that I know the entire Logic Tree team and community is really excited about, which is education. And each of you is really passionate about SDG goals, but also innovations in education in the world that we are currently in. So I think to kick off the panel, I'll have some specific questions for each of you to kind of talk a little bit about your work and what you're seeing in the various education initiatives you're pursuing. But let's take a minute. I know I've given your titles, but if you wouldn't mind sharing just why are you passionate about education? And I'll turn it over to James to go first.
Yeah, so my relationship with education is quite interesting because I was a poor student at school, and I put that down to being academically incapable. And later on in life, I got my degree and my master's and all sorts of other qualifications, and found out that it wasn't that I was a poor academic per se, I just didn't do the work. And what I found interesting is most of my education was done online, remotely. I don't think I've passed a single course where I was taught by a teacher. And that's not uncommon nowadays, because most of the people in the technology field I deal with on a day-to-day basis have taught themselves how to code, have taught themselves how to do the Excel formulas, so on and so forth. So today, technology and education is almost inseparable.
Thanks, James. So for the folks out there that struggle in school or quote unquote a poor student, there is hope. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Amanda. Do you want to just share a little bit about why you're passionate about education and SDG Goal 4?
Yes, thank you so much. It's really, really great to be here. My name is Amanda, and I work for the Global Schools program. So why I'm passionate about education, I do have a background in education and have been on many sides of it. I've taught in the classroom for mostly students 12 to 18. I've designed educational programs for universities. And really what I've seen throughout my career is when you connect students to real world issues, the lessons become really inspiring, showing them how learning grammar is actually important for them in the future and how that can assist them in being more civically engaged. And that's why I'm really passionate about the work I do, especially around SDG 4.
Thanks so much. So now I will turn it over to Meredith.
Yes, thanks very much. So I've spent a lot of time in school, which is why I think that I like education so much. So I started with my undergrad, then my master's in international business, and then my PhD in business education for sustainable development. And while doing that, I lectured in a business school, which is not your traditional place to find the quality education markings for SDGs, but you can see that the interest is there. And whether it's an interest in SDG 4 specifically, or whether it's quality, good health and well-being, something that people can tag to in their own personal lives, whether it's experiences with poverty and hunger, whether it's seeing climate change around them, the way that students engage so excitedly with real world issues is really presented when you use the SDG framework. So I'd say that's why I'm passionate about SDG 4, but just in education overall, the way that you can use it as a tool, like a universal conversation, you can take these lessons to a classroom at any level, and you can really help build out issues so that they become more understandable and then more actionable.
Thanks, Meredith. And finally, Bridget.
Thanks all. It's so good to be here and honored to be amongst these great educators and knowledgeable people in the tech and education space. I'll start off by just sharing again, I'm the Assistant Director for UNICEF Next Gen, and that program is a program that engages people in their 20s and 30s around UNICEF's work. And a big part of that is and the reason why NextGen exists is because we firmly believe that the more people know about issues that are affecting children, the more people will be willing to help. So education really is everything. And without that, people wouldn't be on the front lines wanting to support. So I can share my my original introduction to UNICEF came through my education when I was 6 years old, and I received my little Trick or Treat for UNICEF box. So again, it's all around us and vital to equitable opportunity for children's futures.
I think it's so important, and I sit more in the philanthropy space, but we see the same thing with education, right? That if we can communicate more about what are the needs of our communities, then we can better direct capital where it needs to go. So with that, and also I loved Bridget's example about the trick or treat for UNICEF. I think, if we think about when is early enough to get kids passionate about giving back and about giving to education, I don't think there is a time. I think we, really need to invest in the younger generations that we have. So I'll ask a few questions of Bridget, and then we'll kind of go from panelist to panelist. So Bridget, the first question that I have for you is, can you share a little bit about UNICEF's mission and the NextGen's engaged with advancing this mission, and just kind of the model in general in terms of, mixing NextGens into this organization that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So UNICEF's mission is simple: to save children's lives, to defend their rights, and to ensure that children are reaching their full potential. Simple in in these 3 sentences, in practice a little bit more complex in the various contexts where UNICEF is working. But UNICEF is in 190 countries operating around the globe, and the structure of UNICEF is decentralized. So in order to get sustainable development work done, we have to work with the governments to create effective, sustainable work. So in large part, that is defines our work within the context of the United States, and our work here is mandated to be primarily fundraising, awareness building, education, and then advocacy work, so changing policies that affect children. And so NextGens really operate in full service to all of that work, whether they are helping to ensure that they're set up to be individually giving, or they are fundraising and hosting engagements for their communities to support financially, or they're remote volunteer consulting and they're lending their brains and their skills. A lot of them have founded companies and are taking child-friendly practices into account when they're thinking about the supply chains of their companies. So having NextGens involved in UNICEF's work has been really critical to advancing SDG 4, and really critical overall to making sure that UNICEF's work is relevant for this group of young leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators. And I'll pause there, but happy to share more about the NextGen structure.
Yeah, I think if you want to talk a little bit about how, you have this model of governance with the NextGens and how they decide on the projects that they take on, and what that looks like for UNICEF NextGen.
Absolutely. So as you can imagine, there are a multitude of funding needs every year that UNICEF is sorting through, and they have a very complex algorithm of the highest need at any given time. But we work directly with the global programs team to identify some of those top needs that really aren't getting the attention that might be in the news cycle. And so we build out proposals and share them with the NextGen group, and they actually vote to support. And we feel that having various governance processes throughout our program is really important, because this group is a community and they are so thoughtful and so knowledgeable about sustainable development work. So we really try to bring them into decisions wherever possible. So they elect the projects that we end up funding and supporting, and that they get to learn all about and share all about with their friends. And the other way that we use governance is in enacting our boards, and we have a governance structure where everyone is voting on who gets to sit on our boards. We have 5 boards across the nation, and those boards really run and determine what engagements and opportunities we host within their regions.
Great. Thanks, Bridget. So now I'd love to hear a little bit from Amanda. Can you share about the Global Schools program? I can't even remember how many schools you all work with, as well as how you're thinking about scaling SDG education and just any sort of new initiatives that you all are working on this year.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So basically what Global Schools does is we try to bring education for sustainable development into schools. So broadly, that's the UN SDG framework, teaching the SDGs, but also going beyond that and teaching soft skills like problem solving and collaboration that are encompassed in the SDGs. So currently we have about 1,200 schools in the network. But we mainly focus on teacher training, and that's how we really deepen our engagement with the schools. So this past year, we actually accepted 504 teachers and educators into our training program, and they act as the focal points to kind of spread the message and spread long-term strategies for bringing SDGs in schools with their fellow teachers and school leadership. So our first training cohort that already graduated, they were able to reach 27,000 students directly in their classroom through 2,300 activities and projects on the SDGs. And of course, we have more indirect impact throughout the entire school. We also do a lot of partnering with research foundations to help them do assessments of their current national curriculum and really understanding how they can bring 21st century skills into this curriculum, where are the opportunities to discuss global citizenship, and what's a strategy for scaling this up within their national context. So just to answer your question a little bit about what I'm most excited about and scaling up from here, we really are focusing on continued collaboration and partnership building, but also how to elongate the mandate for these teachers and exploring cross-collaboration tools, such as podcasts and Flipgrid and Padlet, and learning how to really connect these best practices and showcase these best practices that we're seeing, or doing student symposiums where people can share their work. And we're going to be continuing to do our teacher training programs into this year as well, and expanding resources and translations. Because what we have found is it's really crucial to show these students local action pathways that they can use to take action on the SDGs. And that requires local and translated resources as well. So I can stop there. I'm happy to share more specific examples or how that's connected to World Logic Day.
Yeah, I'd love if you want to talk a little bit about how you frame it within World Logic Day, and also just the why behind why do you do this work specifically, right? It's important to me personally, but how might others think about the work that you do and the advancement of the SDGs within the framework of World Logic Day?
Yeah, that's great. So how I think it's connected to World Logic Day specifically is what we really are doing at its heart is promoting partnerships and collaborations across the whole entire school. And UNESCO has a theme a little bit when it comes to peace building around World Logic Day. And education for sustainable development is shown to improve collaboration and problem solving, and actually have more civic engagement and participation from students. So that's really how I think it fits into the framework. So we've seen schools kind of building curriculum committees to discuss human rights and justice and climate and gender and more. And it's really important to give students these skills and the logic around these topics to be able to discuss them. And just to give a specific example, one of our schools in Nigeria developed a waste management advocacy research team where they went out into the community and interviewed people and got their perspectives on waste management. So we also try to teach them how to bring logic to the wider community and give students the tools to kind of think logically, think about different viewpoints, and really advocate for what they believe in. And that goes in line with the theme as well, talking about how education can promote dialogue and understanding.
That's so helpful, Amanda. And I love the example that the students actually went out and retrieved various opinions about the project they were working on. That's great. So I think that transitions nicely into, I'm going to turn it over to James. And James, if you'll talk a little bit about, I know you've consulted for various organizations and helped release different technologies. So how do you see logic playing a role in education? And what are you seeing in terms of education from the various entities that you work for or advise? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
One of the hardest parts of getting a technology commercialized isn't so much the development of the technology itself, but teaching people how to use that technology and getting them to adopt it. We've all been there trying to get Granny to learn how to use the ride share app, etc. You'll be amazed at how even the simplest apps are the hardest for people to adopt and use. One of the main reasons for that to happen is really because of the idea, the time, or the social group you're trying to teach, or the channels that you're using to communicate that message. And if it fails, it tends to be in those 4 areas. One of the biggest changes I've noticed going forward is that in the world of the internet, we now have way more people learning for themselves. And they're going online and getting the information for themselves. And the dangerous part of that is twofold. We're only capable of really grappling with about 8 to 10 issues at one time. So when we do research, we've got thousands and thousands of websites, and we try and we reduce that variety down to a handful. And in doing so, that reductionist thinking, all that we end up doing is picking the websites that reinforce what we already know, and we think we're learning more, but actually what we're doing is learning that what we know is what we know, and we've got loads of people to back up. So one of the challenges in trying to teach people new things and technology is trying to actually get people to search for more and have guided searches in what they're doing, rather than just picking the 8 apps that are more websites that they refer to all the time. Another big challenge I've noticed with the technology and education is people tend to select the perspectives of that validate what they want to listen to and read. And this is possibly one of the most dangerous aspects of the modern world that we live in today, because everything we do, when we select like, or we watch on TV or adverts, etc., that just teaches the computers to reinforce and send us more of the messages that we already believe in, and we just surround ourselves with people that agree with us. Okay, so I tend to avoid doing those sort of like things, and as a net result of that kind of research and that type of education, you're teaching yourself is that you're only finding perspectives that you agree with, and you're only finding the websites that you can handle the complexity of and to do. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges going forward.
Okay, thanks for bearing with us as we dealt with a little bit of audio issues. So I think James's perspective is so important, right? And certainly something that we should be thinking about on World Logic Day, that to not understand opinions different from our own defeats the entire purpose. If we only feed ourselves with what we already know, what are we really growing or learning or challenging our perspectives on? So I loved your point on that. I think turning it to Meredith, I'd love, Meredith, if you talk a little bit about, how do you manage different dialogues around the SDGs and these topics? And what are you seeing within the SDG Academy as you have to tackle various viewpoints or debates or dialogues within education?
Of course. So at the SDG Academy, we address lifelong learners, really. So we'd be everywhere from middle school enrollers up to 90-year-old enrollers. And you would see it across the board. That is really quite a bell curve overall. So we know that the audience that we're engaging with isn't just a certain level of learner, a certain age of learner. A lot of them have undergraduate degrees, but some of them don't even have middle school degrees, if you think about it. So the information that we like to share has to be digestible to audiences around the world at every different level. And while it's important to make content that can be listened to, it's also important to make sure that our content is stated in a way that the experts are speaking, so that students can take the messages into their own home context and their own home cultures to make a difference. Because the courses aren't intended, or the podcasts or the library videos, whatever the medium isn't there to challenge you in a way that like a 600 level course at a university would. It's there to empower learners and to make them better global citizens and more educated in the SDGs. I think that that's really the crossroads where logic comes to play, because all of the decisions that you're making and how you're informing yourself and your challenges in your daily lives and the decisions that you're coming to yourself, even the decision to become more educated around the Sustainable Development Goals, is something that implies logic. But then to go a step further and to take this education that you have either from SDG Academy courses, from your own formal or informal education channels, or from the discussions and dialogues that you're having in your own local networks, to be able to respond to those in logical and educated ways is something it's a universal skill set, despite age, despite background, despite all of those sorts of factors. So at the SDG Academy, what we find challenges is just making sure that the content is universally understood, that content is challenging enough that it challenges your perspective and your worldview so that you're able to go out there and have these informed educational conversations, that you're able to quote the facts and the figures and understand the issues that underpin the SDGs, rather than having a greenwashing conversation to just say that we should fight for SDG 4. Of course we should, but no, let's talk about the issues that are behind that. And then maybe to go a step further to say, my own background's in business education, like I said, and for businesses and for business schools, like there is the traditional theories that you would always see playing out in the classroom. So logic really implies that we should be questioning and we should be challenging these antiquated curriculums by informing them with different nuanced and more holistic worldviews that we've come to understand today. So the SDG Academy really does a good job of not only providing lifelong learning opportunities, but also supplementing the traditional curriculum so that it educates people in a more holistic way.
Thank you for sharing that, Meredith. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Bridget to talk a little bit just about, how do you potentially deal with people that might have hesitancies around involving next gens in their work or in their models, and sort of what have you seen as an expert in that space?
Oh man, I I don't know what anyone is waiting for if they haven't engaged Next Gen already. I of course I'm biased, but the name is self-explanatory. Next Gen is the future, and the future is here. These people are already leaders and CEOs and policymakers and majority wealth holders. And this group of people is really, in all of my experience and all of my work, they really want to be a part of solving the world's issues and making an impact. So I think there's a very strong case for anyone who doesn't already have a next gen engagement strategy to start thinking about what that could look like for you. And I would be really eager to talk to anyone about a next gen strategy. Of course, ours is specific to UNICEF and UNICEF's work and built around those pillars. But I think there are a lot of different ways that you can engage next gen as thought leaders, even just by bringing together working groups. They don't have to be supporting financially yet if that's not a part of your organization or company, but they have a lot to contribute in a variety of ways. We've co-opted this term at UNICEF Next Gen called polycapital, and that means just the entire value that someone can bring, their skills, their networks, sure, perhaps their funding capital or financial resources, but it's so much more than that in our experience. And the combination of everything someone is willing to bring, their resources, their resolve, their enthusiasm, their brains, has really been our next gen success story. So if you're not sold, I'll find you after and we'll talk about next gens.
Thanks for sharing that, Bridget. I think I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then I might open it up for Q&A. So if you're listening in and if you have questions for our panelists, if you want to go ahead and pop them into the chat, I may call them out. But before we switch to Q&A, I'd love to hear from each of you just sort of what you're hoping for happens in terms of education and SDG Goal 4 in this coming year. And or for folks that care about education, what are ways that they can get involved and support the initiatives, and or just what you believe in terms of education for the new year that we're facing. And I'll let you guys kind of just popcorn. So whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
I'll jump in then.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, so trying to educate other people in a logical concept that's new is always difficult. I kind of alluded to that earlier. One of the challenges is the idea itself that you're trying to communicate. And I strongly encourage people to look at the message that they're trying to get across in 5 key areas, which is relative advantage. How much of an advantage is your way of doing something better than the way they come and do it? Because that will cause a bit of resistance. And I also think that as observability is an important factor. How quickly can people see that what you're trying to teach them is actually going to make a difference? Trialability, can they try out the idea and see it working, or is it too cost prohibitive to even choose that course? And the last two I'd say is complexity. If your idea is complex, it's going to be a lot harder for people to buy into it and use it. And how compatible is your idea to what people currently are used to doing? And I see that all the time in technology projects. People just don't want to adopt it, no matter how logical it is. And it's the same with a concept or an idea. So if you're trying to get educated in 2020, if you're trying to give some sort of advice or logical training, try and look at it from about those 5 areas of how solid your idea is to get across.
I can jump in now. So what I would say to people that, really want to get involved in this is, this type of education is not just good for society or for the earth, but when you're advocating, it's also good for the students themselves. So we see in the research that it improves attendance, better learning outcomes, improves soft skills, and improved peace and understanding. So I would encourage people that do want to get involved in the education movement is to, learn about how to be great advocates and what other things, really we need to understand to be able to push forward when you're talking to school leaders or other teachers and getting everyone excited. And to your other question about what I would hope for SDG for in the future is also thinking a little bit more about the students that are left behind, that are out of school, that might be refugees or students with disabilities, and how we can be more inclusive and in incorporating them in some of the activities that we see around the SDGs happening. A lot of the SDG data looks at primary and secondary students, but not necessarily the ages. So are those students, at the levels that they need to be successful? So that's what I would say. And I would encourage anyone to take up this mission and advocacy for education.
I would love to build on that lesson from Amanda right there. One thing that we struggle with a lot is translating our content. So I'd say in the next year, what we'd really love to see is more access, more translation, more development of content across different contexts on kind of a very micro level for what my first hope and dream would be. I've also made about a half-page list of notes of things that I just wish for SDG for in the next year. So just on the next kind of level, for lifelong learning, the SDG Academy has 3 courses coming out this year already. One with UNESCO on intangible cultural heritage, so educating the masses on cultural heritage and more tolerance across societies. One with GIZ, some mapping courses, and one with ILO. So while this is definitely a plug right now, just to say that we're rolling out a number of different ways to get educated in the SDG Academy, just beyond traditional climate education, beyond just traditional early childhood development, but into kind of more focused themes so that those conversations can move forward. There's also a big, we're on a webinar, so it feels a bit daunting to call out webinars, but to move beyond just the conversations that we have in these one-on-one windows, where webinar fatigue has become a real thing over the last 2 years, to be considering more innovative means of connecting with each other and expanding messages beyond that. I know personally we've begun running podcasts. Amanda's mentioned podcasts as well, but just more novel and integrated ways to have these high-level conversations and to spread the word more globally. And then from a large laundry list, the systems perspective I'd want to touch on for the dreams of SDG 4. It's nice to see that ratings and rankings and assessments organizations are really starting to look at higher education and ask sustainable development questions to make more critical calls on rankings and ratings based on the SDGs or based on the principles of the SDGs. So embedding a layer of criticality in higher education for 2022 would be one major focus. And then also at the end of COP26, that narrative that they were pushing for COP27 around the prioritization of education and the importance of education in the climate change narrative. I think this will be the year that becomes quite a big lesson. So that's my biggest goal for 2022 right there with education and SDG 4.
Thanks, Meredith. Bridget, do you want to close us out with this round of questions?
Absolutely, yes, and fully echo everything all the other panelists have covered so far. I think the main theme that I have heard you all touch on is how interdependent education work is. We could focus solely on education, but if we're not looking at it through a gendered lens, girls will continue to miss out on the opportunities to receive quality education. And if we're not thinking about and getting really proactive about climate change issues, even more children will be on the run, and we all know how challenging it is to deliver quality education in a context where families are on the go. So I'll just share one hopefully inspiring story to close us out, which is a project that NextGen funded in 2018 in South Africa. And one of the major issues in South Africa within delivering on quality education was that teachers were absent and they had no accountability mechanism to figure out where this was happening, why it was happening so frequently, and to ensure that it stopped. Because as you can imagine, the teacher not being present is a huge barrier to receiving quality education. So UNICEF Innovation created something called U-Report, which is a messaging tool that empowers young people around the world to engage with and speak out on issues that matter to them. And it now is used in a multitude of ways, but the one way that it was used in this situation was kids were reporting when their teacher didn't show up to their class. And then they were able to take that data and share it with local community members and policyholders and figure out where this was happening and stop the issues so that children were able to be in class with their teacher there to teach them. And I think it's just an example of how powerful innovation is in driving education tools and helping us advance quality education for all.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And thank you to all of our panelists that were willing to join us and talk about SDG Goal 4 and education and how it relates to World Logic Day. We're so glad that you joined us for today. We are going to transition and take about a little less than 30-minute break prior to our next panel on crypto. So we will leave you for now, but hope you guys will join us back here at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Thanks again.